Late at night, the parking lot of a small suburban grocery store was quiet, bathed in the cold, sterile glow of overhead lights. A few scattered cars were parked haphazardly across the lot, their owners likely inside, browsing the aisles, unaware of the tension about to unfold just outside. Among the vehicles stood a nondescript sedan with a dark grey finish, unremarkable and blending into the surrounding shadows. Its driver, Layla Houston, stepped out, closing the door softly behind her. Her demeanor was calm, her movements deliberate, yet her presence carried an air of quiet authority that was impossible to ignore. Layla was dressed simply in jeans, a fitted jacket, and a pair of well-worn sneakers clothes that gave no indication of her true identity. She carried a medium-sized black duffel bag, slung casually over her shoulder, the strap pressing tightly against her frame. To anyone watching, she would appear to be an ordinary woman on her way home after a long day. But there was nothing ordinary about her. Layla was a CIA operative with years of field experience, known for her ability to blend in seamlessly in any environment. This unassuming appearance had saved her life more than once, and tonight it would once again serve its purpose. Her mission had ended only hours earlier, a quiet, covert operation dismantling a domestic cyber-terrorist ring. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was essential, and Layla had taken pride in her meticulous execution of every detail. Tonight, though, her mind was far from the adrenaline of espionage. All she wanted was to pick up a few essentials, drive home, and collapse into the comfort of her couch. The bag she carried contained nothing more than the tools of her trade: a laptop, secure documents, and encrypted communication devices, all locked behind several layers of security. It was second nature to her to always have these items on hand, even when she was off the clock. As Layla walked toward the grocery store's entrance, her sharp instincts caught the faint sound of tires crunching on gravel. A patrol car idled at the far end of the lot, its headlights dim but its presence unmistakable. Layla didn't break her stride, but her senses heightened. She had dealt with law enforcement countless times during her career, sometimes as an ally, other times as a suspect when her covers had been blown. She hoped this would be one of the rare occasions where no interaction would be necessary. Inside the car sat Officer Derek Sanders, his gaze fixed on Layla with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. Sanders was a man deeply frustrated with his life and career, his personal failures fueling a bitterness that manifested in his professional conduct. 10 years on the force had yielded little more than a tarnished reputation and a record of disciplinary warnings. His self-image as a righteous enforcer of the law had long been eroded by years of routine traffic stops and mundane patrols. Tonight, however, he saw an opportunity to assert himself. Layla's presence struck a chord in Derek. To him, she didn't fit the mold of someone who belonged here, walking alone at this hour with a bag that seemed to scream contraband to his increasingly paranoid mind. Her composed demeanor only further fueled his suspicions. In Derek's eyes, no one should look so calm, so confident, in this part of town unless they had something to hide. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel, his mind racing with assumptions, each more unfounded than the last. He didn't need a reason to act, he convinced himself he already had one. As Layla neared the entrance of the store, Derek made his move. The patrol car's headlights flared to life, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The engine growled as he pulled forward, his tires squealing slightly on the pavement. Layla turned her head subtly, her eyes narrowing as she watched the car approach. She could already feel the confrontation brewing. Derek stopped abruptly a few feet from her, stepping out with an air of self-importance, his hand resting on the holster of his sidearm. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, but there was no mistaking the tension in his posture. "Evening," Maram, Derek said, his voice sharp and authoritative. He sized her up, his eyes flickering from her face to the bag slung over her shoulder. "Out a little late, aren't we?" Layla paused, her expression neutral but her mind calculating every possible outcome of this interaction. She knew his type: aggressive, overconfident, and quick to assume the worst. Her training told her to remain calm, to de-escalate if possible, but she also knew when a situation was beyond salvaging. "Is there something I can help you with, officer?" she replied evenly, her tone giving away none of the annoyance she felt. Derek took a step closer, his presence looming as he gestured toward the bag. "What's in the bag?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing. "That's a pretty big bag to be carrying around at this hour." Layla resisted the urge to sigh. She had encountered men like him before, men who thrived on exerting their authority over those they deemed weaker. "Just some personal items," she said simply. "Nothing illegal, I assure you." Derek's jaw tightened. He wasn't satisfied with her answer, nor was he interested in her assurance. He was already forming a narrative in his head, one where she was the villain and he was the hero who caught her in the act. "I'm going to need you to open it," he said, his voice carrying an edge of hostility. Layla knew this wasn't a request. She also knew that complying wouldn't end the encounter, it would only escalate it. But she couldn't afford to reveal the contents of the bag. It contained classified materials that were not meant for prying eyes. Her options narrowed as she calculated her response. "I'm sorry, officer, but I can't do that," she said firmly. "This bag contains sensitive items, and I have every right to protect my privacy." Derek's face darkened, his patience evaporating. He stepped closer, his hand now resting on his belt. "Sensitive items? That's a convenient excuse. You think you're above the law?" His voice rose slightly, drawing the attention of a few passers-by in the distance. Layla noticed them out of the corner of her eye but didn't allow herself to be distracted. Her focus remained solely on Derek. "I think we're done here," Layla said, her tone sharpening as she moved to step around him. But Derek wasn't about to let her go. His hand shot out, grabbing her by the arm with more force than necessary. The sudden physical contact triggered a reflexive reaction in Layla, her body tensing as her training kicked in. She stopped herself from retaliating, knowing that a single misstep could turn this confrontation into something far worse. "Not so fast," Derek growled, his grip tightening. "You're coming with me until we figure out what you're hiding." Layla's mind raced as she weighed her options. She could overpower him in an instant. His stance was sloppy, his grip weak, but doing so would only validate his baseless accusations. Instead, she took a deep breath, locking eyes with him as she spoke with quiet authority. "Officer, I strongly suggest you let me go. You're making a mistake you'll regret." But Derek wasn't listening. His ego had taken control, and his determination to assert his dominance blinded him to the warning signs. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Layla, however, was fully aware of the storm that was about to erupt. Derek's grip on Layla's arm was firm, almost bruising, and the tension between them was palpable, hanging in the cold night air like a storm about to break. His eyes were narrowed with suspicion, his lips pressed into a thin, determined line. Layla kept her expression calm, though inside her mind was racing through dozens of scenarios and outcomes. She could feel the weight of the duffel bag on her shoulder and the classified materials inside it, materials that could not, under any circumstances, fall into the hands of someone like Derek. Her instincts screamed at her to act, but her training reminded her that patience could often diffuse a situation better than force. "You're refusing a lawful order," Derek growled, tightening his grip as though that would somehow solidify his authority. "I told you to open the bag. If you're not hiding anything, then there's no reason for you to refuse." Layla's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. Officer, you have no grounds to search my belongings. I've committed no crime, and I have the right to protect my personal property. I suggest you reconsider your actions before they escalate further. Her voice was calm, controlled, and for a brief moment it gave Derek pause. But only for a moment. He scoffed, the sound sharp and dismissive, and yanked her arm slightly to pull her closer. "Oh, you're one of those, huh? Think you can lecture me on the law? Let me tell you something, lady. Out here, it's my word that matters." Layla felt the heat of anger rising in her chest, but she forced it down. Losing her temper would only fuel Derek's need to assert control. Instead, she shifted her weight slightly, testing his grip, noting the weakness in his stance. If it came to it, she could break free in less than a second. But for now she stayed still, her eyes flicking briefly to the patrol car parked nearby. She needed to end this before backup arrived, and the situation spiraled completely out of control. "You don't want to do this," she said, her tone firm but devoid of emotion. "You're acting on assumptions, officer, and I promise you, they're wrong. This isn't going to end the way you think it will." Derek smirked, a cold, humorless expression that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see about that." With a sudden, sharp tug, he pulled the duffel bag off her shoulder and stepped back, holding it triumphantly as though he'd just uncovered some grand criminal plot. Layla's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her body tensing involuntarily as she watched him unzip the bag with a theatrical flourish. Inside, he found exactly what she had told him was there: a laptop, a neatly folded set of clothing, and a few nondescript personal items. For a moment, Derek faltered, his confidence wavering as he stared down at the innocuous contents. But instead of admitting his mistake, he doubled down, his face twisting with frustration. He rummaged through the bag with unnecessary force, as if hoping something incriminating would magically appear. "This isn't over," he muttered, more to himself than to Layla. He pulled out the laptop, holding it up as though it were a smoking gun. "What's on this? Huh? Got anything you don't want me to see?" Layla took a slow, measured breath, fighting the urge to grab the device out of his hand. "That's my work laptop. It's encrypted and contains sensitive information. If you tamper with it, you'll be violating federal security protocols." Derek's eyes snapped to hers, his smirk returning as he misinterpreted her warning as fear. "Oh, is that right? Sensitive information, huh? Sounds to me like you've got something to hide." He placed the laptop on the hood of his patrol car, his hand hovering over it as though he were considering prying it open. Layla's heart rate quickened. The laptop's contents were secure, protected by multiple layers of encryption. But it wasn't the laptop itself she was worried about. It was the escalating arrogance in Derek's actions, the recklessness with which he seemed determined to push her buttons. "Step back," he ordered, pointing a finger at her as though she were a misbehaving child. "You're officially being detained for obstruction of justice. Anything you say can and will be used against you." Layla tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "On what grounds?" Derek hesitated, clearly caught off guard by her calm defiance. "You're refusing to comply with a lawful search," he said after a beat, his voice rising in volume as though sheer force could compensate for his lack of justification. "That's not how the law works," Officer Layla said evenly. "You need probable cause to conduct a search, and you don't have it. I suggest you check your facts before you make a mistake you can't undo." Oh, her words only seemed to infuriate him further. His face reddened, and he stepped toward her, his posture aggressive. "I don't need a lecture from you," he snapped. "You're not in charge here." "I am." In that moment, Layla realized there was no reasoning with him. Derek wasn't interested in the truth or the law, he was interested in power. His actions were driven not by duty, but by ego, and she knew that appealing to logic or morality would only fall on deaf ears. She felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with knowing a situation was about to turn physical, and she began to mentally prepare herself for what was to come. As Derek reached for her wrist, intending to cuff her, Layla moved. It was a small, subtle shift, but it was enough to throw him off balance. His grip faltered, and she stepped back, putting a safe distance between them. "Don't," she warned, her voice low and steady. "This isn't going to end well for you." But Derek didn't heed her warning. He lunged forward, his hand outstretched, and Layla reacted instinctively. She sidestepped his advance, her movements fluid and precise, and grabbed his wrist, twisting it just enough to make him release his hold on her. He stumbled, caught off guard by her speed and strength, and for a brief moment, he looked at her with something resembling fear. "What the hell are you?" he demanded, clutching his wrist as he backed away. Layla didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her posture, her calm demeanor, and the efficiency of her movements had already spoken volumes. But she knew this wasn't over. Derek wasn't the type to back down, and his pride wouldn't allow him to walk away without trying to reassert his dominance. As he reached for his radio to call for backup, Layla took a step forward, her expression hardening. "You don't want to do that," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Walk away now, and we both leave this night without further consequences." Derek froze, his hand hovering over the radio. His breathing was heavy, his chest rising and falling with the effort to maintain control. For a moment it seemed as though he might listen, as though he might recognize the futility of continuing this fight. But then his eyes hardened, and he made his decision. "You think you can intimidate me," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You're just another." Layla didn't let him finish. She moved swiftly, her hand darting out to snatch the radio from his grasp. The motion was so quick and so unexpected that Derek didn't have time to react. She held the device in her hand for a moment before tossing it aside, the plastic clattering against the pavement. "This is your last chance," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Walk away." The silence that followed was deafening, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Derek stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and barely contained rage. But Layla stood her ground, her gaze unwavering, and in that moment it became clear that she was no ordinary woman. Derek didn't know who or what she was, but for the first time, he began to wonder if he had made a grave mistake. Derek's face flushed with humiliation and rage, his pride clearly wounded by how effortlessly Layla had diffused his attempt to assert control. For a moment he stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides, his chest heaving as he struggled to process what had just happened. Layla remained calm, her posture composed but alert, ready for whatever came next. She could see the gears turning in Derek's head, his emotions warring with logic, but she already knew how this would end. Men like Derek didn't back down not because they were brave, but because they couldn't tolerate the idea of being shown up, especially not by someone they perceived as beneath them. Derek took a step forward, his boots crunching on the pavement, and Layla's muscles tensed ever so slightly. "You think you're tough," he spat, his voice low and venomous. "You think you can just walk away from this? Not on my watch." He reached for his baton, pulling it from his belt with a practiced flick of his wrist. The weapon gleamed under the harsh lights of the parking lot, and Derek gave it a quick, menacing twirl before leveling it at her. "You're resisting a lawful order. That's assault on an officer, and I've got every right to take you down." Layla tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Put it away," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You're making a mistake." But Derek was beyond reasoning. He lunged forward, swinging the baton in a wide arc aimed at her midsection. Layla stepped back, the motion so fluid and precise that it almost looked effortless, and the baton sliced harmlessly through the air where she'd been standing a split second earlier. Derek growled in frustration, his grip tightening on the weapon as he adjusted his stance for another strike. Layla didn't wait for him to attack again. She moved quickly, stepping inside his guard and grabbing his wrist with one hand, while her other hand shot up to press against his elbow. With a sharp, controlled motion, she twisted his arm, forcing him to drop the baton. It clattered to the ground, the sound echoing loudly in the otherwise silent parking lot. Derek cried out in pain, stumbling back as he clutched his now throbbing wrist. "Stop this," Layla said, her tone low and steady. "You're out of your depth, officer. Walk away before this gets worse." But Derek's pride wouldn't allow him to retreat. His face contorted with fury as he reached for his taser, yanking it free from his belt with a trembling hand. He didn't even hesitate, he pulled the trigger, the weapon crackling to life as the prongs shot toward her. Layla twisted her body to the side, narrowly avoiding the wires, and closed the distance between them in an instant. Before Derek could react, she grabbed the taser, ripping it out of his hand and tossing it to the ground far out of reach. Derek stumbled back again, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps as he stared at her with wide, disbelieving eyes. He had underestimated her, and now he didn't know how to regain control of the situation. Layla could see the panic setting in, the way his gaze darted around the parking lot, as if searching for something, anything that could turn the tide in his favor. "I'm warning you," Layla said, her voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. "You don't want to take this any further." But Derek was beyond reason. With a guttural yell, he charged at her, his hands reaching for her throat in a desperate, clumsy attempt to overpower her. Layla sidestepped him easily, letting his momentum carry him forward, and as he stumbled past her, she planted a well-placed kick to the back of his knee. Derek's leg buckled, and he dropped to the ground with a grunt, catching himself on his hands and knees. Layla stepped back, her breathing steady as she watched him struggle to get up. "You're done," she said simply, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Stay down." But Derek wasn't listening. With a pained growl, he pushed himself to his feet, his movements slow and unsteady. His hand went to his belt again, this time pulling his radio free. He held it up, his thumb hovering over the button to call for backup. Layla's eyes narrowed. "Don't do it," she warned. Derek's lips curled into a sneer, his confidence momentarily bolstered by the thought of reinforcements. "You're going to regret this," he hissed, pressing the button. "This is Officer Sanders requesting immediate backup. Suspect resisting arrest. Possible assault." Layla sighed, her patience wearing thin. She had tried to end this peacefully, but Derek was determined to push her. And now, with backup on the way, the situation was about to become even more complicated. She couldn't afford to let this escalate any further. Moving quickly, Layla stepped forward and grabbed the radio out of his hand. Derek tried to resist, but she was faster, stronger, and far more skilled. She tossed the radio aside, the device skidding across the pavement and coming to rest several feet away. "Enough," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. "This ends now." Derek glared at her, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. "You think you're above the law," he spat. "You think you can just do whatever you want." "No," Layla replied, her tone as calm as ever. "I think you need to take a hard look at yourself and ask why you're so determined to make an enemy out of someone who's done nothing wrong." Her words hit him like a slap to the face, and for a moment Derek faltered. But the humiliation, the rage, the sheer inability to admit he was in the wrong, all of it boiled over, and he snapped. With a roar, he lunged at her again, his fists swinging wildly. This time, Layla didn't hold back. She sidestepped his clumsy attack and struck with precision, delivering a sharp blow to his solar plexus that left him gasping for air. Before he could recover, she stepped behind him, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back. With a quick, practiced motion, she swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. Derek groaned, the fight finally leaving his body as he lay sprawled on the pavement. Layla released his arm and stepped back, giving him space to breathe. "Stay down," she said again, her tone firm but not unkind. For several long moments, Derek didn't move. He just lay there, his chest rising and falling as he stared up at the night sky. Layla watched him carefully, ready to act if he tried anything else, but it seemed he had finally realized he was beaten. The sound of approaching sirens broke the silence, the flashing lights of patrol cars casting long shadows across the parking lot. Layla glanced toward the street, her mind already racing as she prepared for the next phase of this confrontation. Derek's backup had arrived, and she knew she would need to tread carefully if she wanted to get out of this without further complications. As the first patrol car screeched to a halt, 2 officers stepped out, their hands hovering near their holsters as they took in the scene. Derek, still lying on the ground, raised a trembling hand and pointed at Layla. She attacked me," he rasped, his voice filled with equal parts anger and desperation. Layla didn't flinch. She stood tall, her posture calm and confident, as the officers approached. "That's not what happened," she said evenly. "And I can prove it." The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions wary as they looked between her and Derek. One of them gestured for her to stay where she was while the other knelt beside Derek, helping him sit up. "What's going on here?" the first officer asked, his tone sharp. Layla met his gaze, her eyes steady. "Your colleague tried to detain me without cause," she said. "He escalated the situation, and I defended myself. If you'd like to verify my identity, I can show you my credentials." Derek let out a bitter laugh, his voice hoarse. "Don't listen to her. She's lying. That's enough," the second officer interrupted, his tone curt. He turned to Layla, his hand still hovering near his weapon. "Let's see those credentials." Layla nodded, moving slowly as she reached into her jacket and pulled out her ID. She held it out to the officer, who took it and examined it closely. His eyes widened slightly as he read the information, and when he looked back at her, his expression had shifted. There was no longer suspicion in his gaze, but something closer to respect, and maybe even fear. He said carefully, handing her ID back. "I think we're going to need to have a conversation." The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the parking lot, casting a chaotic interplay of shadows across the cracked pavement. Layla remained calm and composed, standing tall as 2 additional patrol officers began assessing the situation. Her instincts were on high alert, but she knew that making even the smallest misstep could turn the already volatile encounter into something far more dangerous. The officer who had taken her credentials moments earlier looked visibly shaken as he stepped back toward his partner, his hand still clutching her ID. She's CIA," the officer muttered under his breath to his colleague, his voice barely audible over the distant sound of sirens and the muffled hum of the patrol cars. The second officer frowned, his eyes narrowing as he glanced between Layla and Derek, who was now sitting up on the ground, clutching his side and glaring at her with a mixture of rage and humiliation. "CIA," the second officer repeated, louder this time. His gaze shifted back to Layla, scanning her carefully as though trying to reconcile her unassuming appearance with the revelation of her identity. What the hell is going on here? Layla took a slow breath, her calm, measured tone cutting through the tense air. "Exactly what I said. Your colleague stopped me without cause, escalated the situation, and then tried to detain me unlawfully. I acted in self-defense, and now we're here." Derek, still struggling to catch his breath, exploded into a fit of anger, his voice hoarse but filled with venom. "Don't listen to her. She's making it up. She's probably carrying." He paused, his hand gesturing vaguely toward her bag, as though searching for the words to incriminate her. "Who knows what she's hiding in there? Drugs? Weapons? Hell, maybe even explosives." The second officer raised a hand, silencing Derek with a sharp, commanding gesture. "Sanders, stop. You're not helping." His tone was firm, carrying the authority of someone who was used to dealing with difficult situations. He turned back to Layla, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Ma'am, I understand you're claiming self-defense, but you have to admit, this is an unusual situation. Would you mind explaining what's in the bag?" Layla's posture didn't waver, her expression remaining neutral. "It's classified," she said simply, her tone leaving no room for negotiation, "and any further inquiries would need to go through the proper federal channels. I can provide contact information for my agency if necessary, but I'm not at liberty to share anything beyond that." The second officer's brow furrowed, and he exchanged a look with his partner, who still appeared visibly uncomfortable. "All right," he said slowly, clearly trying to weigh his options. "But you can understand how this looks to us. We get a call for backup, find one of our own on the ground, and you're standing there claiming you're CIA. It's not exactly an everyday scenario." "I understand," Layla replied. "But your colleague's actions are the reason you're here right now, not mine. If you'd like, I can walk you through exactly what happened, but I suggest we deal with the immediate situation first." Her calm, professional demeanor seemed to momentarily disarm the second officer, but before he could respond, Derek surged to his feet, his movements clumsy but fueled by a simmering rage. "This is bullshit," he shouted, his voice cracking as he pointed an accusatory finger at Layla. "She's playing you, can't you see that? This whole CIA act, it's probably fake. She's dangerous, and she needs to be detained right now." The first officer stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Derek's chest to stop him from advancing any further. "Sanders, enough," he said sharply, his tone brooking no argument. "You're out of line." Derek's face twisted in fury, but he didn't push back against his colleague. Instead, he glared at Layla with unbridled hatred, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Layla met his gaze steadily, her expression unflinching. She had encountered men like Derek before, men who hid their insecurities and inadequacies behind a badge, using their authority as a weapon rather than a tool for justice. He was predictable, and that predictability gave her an edge. The tension in the parking lot was thick, the silence stretching uncomfortably as the two patrol officers tried to decide how to proceed. Layla could sense their unease, the way their eyes darted between her, Derek, and the discarded baton and taser lying on the ground nearby. They were trained for conflict, but this situation was outside the scope of their usual protocol, and it showed. Finally, the second officer broke the silence. "All right," he said, his voice measured. "Sanders, you need to step back and let us handle this." "Ma'am," he turned to Layla, "I'm going to need you to stay right where you are while we sort this out. No sudden movements, okay?" Layla nodded once, her movements slow and deliberate. "Understood." But just as the second officer turned to retrieve his radio, a sharp, piercing noise cut through the air, a high-pitched beeping coming from the direction of Layla's bag. The sound was sudden and jarring, like an alarm going off, and it instantly put everyone on edge. The second officer froze mid-step, his hand hovering over his holstered weapon, while Derek took a wary step back, his earlier bravado replaced with a flicker of uncertainty. "What the hell is that?" the second officer demanded, his voice rising slightly as he stared at the bag. Layla's heart sank, though her expression remained neutral. She recognized the sound immediately. It was the proximity alert from one of the secure devices in her bag, a fail-safe mechanism designed to activate if the equipment detected unauthorized tampering. The signal wasn't dangerous in itself, but it would only add to the officer's suspicions if she didn't address it quickly. "It's a security measure," Layla said, her voice calm but firm. "One of the devices in my bag is programmed to emit an alert if it detects interference. It's harmless, but it's sensitive, and I suspect Officer Sanders triggered it when he mishandled my belongings." Derek's face turned red, his jaw tightening as he opened his mouth to retort, but the second officer cut him off. "Sanders, is that true? Did you mess with her bag?" I was doing my job," Derek snapped, his tone defensive. "She refused to cooperate, so I had every right to search her stuff." The second officer's expression darkened, and he let out a slow breath through his nose. "That's not what I asked. Did you tamper with anything?" Derek hesitated, his gaze darting to the side as though searching for an escape route. "I might have touched something," he admitted grudgingly, his voice barely above a mumble. The second officer sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose in frustration. "God damn it, Sanders." Layla took the opportunity to step forward slightly, her movements slow and deliberate so as not to alarm the officers. "If you allow me to access the device, I can disable the alert," she said. "It's not a threat to anyone, but it's going to keep beeping until I address it." The second officer hesitated, clearly torn between wanting to maintain control of the situation and recognizing that Layla's expertise might be the only way to resolve it. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "All right, but do it slowly. And we're watching you." "Of course," Layla replied, her tone even. She crouched down, carefully unzipping the bag and reaching inside. Her fingers found the device quickly, a compact, metallic tablet-like instrument with a small blinking light at the top. She tapped a series of commands into the interface, her movements precise and practiced, and the beeping stopped abruptly. "There," she said, straightening up and holding the device out for the officers to see. "This is what triggered the alert. It's a secure communication tool, and it's encrypted. Nothing dangerous." The second officer eyed the device warily but nodded slowly. "All right. Thank you for handling that." Derek, however, wasn't satisfied. "You're just going to take her word for it?" he demanded, his voice dripping with incredulity. "She could have done anything with that thing. For all we know, she's sending out a signal for backup." Layla raised an eyebrow, her patience wearing thin. "If I were calling for backup, Officer Sanders," she said coolly, "you'd already know it." The second officer shot Derek a warning look, effectively silencing him. Turning back to Layla, he gestured toward the bag. "I think we need to take this one step at a time. Let's keep this civil while we figure out where to go from here." The beeping of the security device had stopped, but the tension in the air was far from dissipating. Layla carefully placed the device back into her bag, her movements deliberate and calm. She could feel the eyes of the officers on her, especially Derek, whose glare burned with a mixture of frustration, humiliation, and unyielding rage. Despite his colleagues' clear attempts to de-escalate the situation, Derek seemed unwilling to let it go. To him, this wasn't just a matter of law enforcement, it was personal now. Layla had made him look weak, exposed his inadequacies, and challenged the authority he so desperately clung to. He wasn't about to let her walk away unscathed. The second officer, clearly the senior of the two backups, took a step closer to Layla. His stance was cautious, but there was a visible shift in his demeanor. The way he had responded to seeing her credentials suggested he was beginning to take her seriously, but at the same time, He was grappling with the strangeness of the situation. His hand hovered near his holster, not quite reaching for it, but not entirely at ease either. "All right, Miss Heston," he said, his tone measured but firm. "You've provided your credentials, and I recognize the authority behind them. But you have to understand that this is still a complicated situation. We need to verify everything before we can move forward. That's standard procedure." Layla nodded slightly, her expression unreadable. "I understand, officer. But I'd like to remind you that my presence here is lawful, and your colleague's actions escalated this situation unnecessarily. I have no objection to you doing your job, but I won't tolerate any further violations of my rights." Derek let out a bitter laugh, his voice cutting through the relative quiet like a knife. "Your rights? That's rich coming from someone who just assaulted a police officer. You think flashing some fancy badge means you're above the law? You're nothing but." "Sanders, that's enough." The senior officer's voice was sharp, authoritative, and carried the weight of someone who was tired of dealing with insubordination. He shot Derek a look that could have silenced a lesser man, but Derek's hands were already shaking with pent-up aggression. His ego was fraying at the edges, and the tension in his body was almost palpable. He was teetering on the brink of doing something reckless, and Layla could see it as clearly as the flashing lights reflecting off the pavement. Before the senior officer could continue, Derek took a step forward, his hand darting toward his belt. For a split second, Layla thought he might be reaching for another weapon, his gun, perhaps, or even a knife, but instead, he grabbed a pair of handcuffs. "No," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "I'm done standing around and listening to this bullshit. You're under arrest." Layla's gaze didn't waver as she stared him down, her body remaining perfectly still. "On what charges?" she asked, her tone steady, almost cold. She knew his answer didn't matter. This wasn't about the law anymore. This was about him trying to salvage his pride. Obstruction. Assault. Resisting arrest, Derek snapped, stepping closer with the cuffs in hand. "Take your pick. I've got plenty to work with." The senior officer stepped between them, holding up a hand to stop Derek's advance. "Sanders, stand down," he barked. "This isn't your call to make." Derek didn't stop. "She's dangerous. You saw that thing in her bag. It could be anything. She could be lying about who she is. Hell, for all we know, she's some kind of spy." His words came out in a rush, his voice climbing in pitch as his desperation mounted. He was unraveling before their eyes, and even his partner seemed to recognize it. "Sanders, step back," the senior officer repeated, his voice low and commanding. "That's an order." But Derek ignored him. He surged forward, one hand reaching for Layla's arm while the other tried to snap the cuffs onto her wrist. That was his mistake. Layla's body moved before her mind had even registered the motion, a swift, precise reaction born from years of training. She twisted out of his grasp with a fluid motion, her foot sliding behind his ankle as she hooked her leg around his. In one swift movement, she swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the pavement with a resounding thud. The sound echoed through the parking lot, and for a moment everything seemed to freeze. Derek groaned, his head hitting the asphalt as he struggled to push himself up. The senior officer's hand went to his weapon, but he didn't draw it. His partner looked equally stunned, his eyes darting between Derek on the ground and Layla, who remained calm and composed, her posture loose but ready. "Enough," Layla said, her voice firm and unyielding. She didn't shout, but the weight of her words carried through the air like a physical force. "This ends now." The senior officer held up both hands, a gesture of placation as he took a step closer. "MS. Houston, please," he said carefully, his tone shifting to something almost conciliatory. "I understand your frustration, but we need to de-escalate this situation. Let's all take a step back and regroup. I've been trying to de-escalate this situation since it began, Layla replied evenly. But your colleague refuses to act within the bounds of his authority. I've shown you my credentials. I've explained the contents of my bag, and I've exercised considerable restraint in the face of his aggression. At this point, the only escalation is coming from him. Derek groaned again, finally managing to push himself onto his hands and knees. His face was red, his breathing labored, and his eyes were filled with unbridled rage. You, bitch, he spat, his voice dripping with venom. You think you're better than me. You think you can just humiliate me and walk away. Layla didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence was more powerful than any words could have been, and it only seemed to enrage Derek further. He stumbled to his feet, his movements unsteady but fueled by sheer determination. His hand went to his boot, and for a split second, Layla's eyes narrowed. She saw the glint of metal before it was fully revealed, and her body moved on instinct. The knife was small, barely more than a utility blade, but it was enough to turn the already volatile situation into something far more dangerous. Derek lunged forward, the blade flashing in the harsh light as he swung it toward her. Layla sidestepped the attack, her movements quick and controlled, and grabbed his wrist in mid-swing. With a sharp twist, she disarmed him, sending the knife clattering to the ground. Derek cried out in pain, his wrist bending at an awkward angle as Layla locked his arm behind his back and forced him to his knees. The senior officer finally drew his weapon, though he didn't point it at her. "MS. Houston, stop," he shouted. "Let him go." Layla complied immediately, releasing Derek and stepping back with her hands raised in a gesture of non-aggression. "I'm done," she said simply. "But if he tries that again, I won't be as forgiving." Derek collapsed onto the ground, cradling his wrist as he glared up at her with a mixture of pain and fury. The senior officer holstered his weapon, his expression a mixture of frustration and exhaustion. "Sanders," he said sharply, his voice cold. "You're done. Go sit in the car." Derek didn't move. I said go sit in the car," the senior officer barked, cutting him off. His tone left no room for argument, and after a long moment, Derek finally relented. He staggered to his feet, shooting one last hateful glare at Layla before limping toward the patrol car. The senior officer turned back to Layla, his expression grim. "This isn't over," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the night's events. "But for now, I think we all need to take a step back and let cooler heads prevail." Layla nodded once, her posture relaxing slightly. "Agreed. But if you don't address his behavior, it will be far from the last time this happens." The officer didn't reply, but the look in his eyes suggested he knew she was right. The air in the parking lot was electric with tension, a silence stretching between the figures like the calm before a storm. Layla stood tall, her expression composed but her senses razor-sharp. Derek had been escorted to the patrol car, muttering curses under his breath, his pride bruised and his wrist lightly sprained from her earlier takedown. The senior officer remained near her, his posture stiff and his eyes cautious. The gravity of the situation was finally sinking in, and Layla could see the calculations happening in his mind. This wasn't just another routine altercation. He was now dealing with someone far beyond his usual scope, a CIA operative who had not only defended herself expertly, but had remained calm under a barrage of hostility. "All right," the senior officer finally said, his voice low but firm. "We need to wrap this up. MS. Houston, I need to formally document your credentials and report this incident to my superiors. It's standard procedure when dealing with interagency personnel." Layla gave a small nod, her voice steady. Of course, I'll provide the necessary information, but I expect your report to include an accurate account of what transpired here tonight. Officer Sanders' behavior wasn't just unprofessional, it was dangerous. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his gaze briefly flicking toward the patrol car where Derek sat sulking, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard lights. I understand your concerns, ma'am. Believe me, this isn't something we take lightly. Layla raised an eyebrow, her tone measured but pointed. I hope that's true, officer, because if you don't address this, someone else will. The officer exhaled heavily, nodding as he reached for his radio to call in the situation. Just as he keyed the mic, however, a sharp, jarring noise cut through the stillness, a metallic clang, followed by the unmistakable sound of a car door slamming. Layla's eyes snapped to the patrol car, her instincts flaring to life. Derek had stepped out, his movements erratic and frantic. His face was twisted with a mixture of rage and desperation, and in his hand was the knife she had disarmed him of earlier. He must have grabbed it from the ground before retreating to the car, biding his time until he could make one last, reckless move. The senior officer spun toward him, his hand flying to his holstered gun. Sanders. Stand down, he barked, his voice ringing with authority. Put the knife down now. But Derek wasn't listening. His eyes were wild, his chest heaving as he glared at Layla with unbridled hatred. You think you can just humiliate me? You think you can walk away from this like nothing happened? His voice was a raw, guttural snarl, each word laced with venom. I'll show you what happens when you mess with me. Layla didn't flinch. Her body remained perfectly still, but every muscle was coiled like a spring, ready to act. She'd seen this kind of desperation before, the dangerous combination of wounded pride and blind rage that left people incapable of rational thought. Derek wasn't thinking about consequences anymore. He was thinking about retribution, about clawing back the sense of control he'd lost over the course of the night. Derek, the senior officer, said again, his tone firm but edged with urgency. This is your last warning. Drop the knife and get back in the car. Don't make this worse for yourself. But Derek only took a step forward, his grip tightening on the knife. She's not walking out of here, he growled, his eyes locked onto Layla like a predator zeroing in on its prey. Layla's voice cut through the tension like a blade, calm but commanding. Derek, listen to me. This is over. Put the knife down, walk away, and take whatever consequences come your way. If you keep going, you'll only make things worse for yourself and everyone around you. For a split second, it seemed like her words might have reached him. Derek faltered, his steps slowing, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. But the moment passed as quickly as it came. His face twisted with renewed anger, and with a guttural yell, he charged toward her, the knife raised high. Time seemed to slow as Layla moved. Her training took over, her body reacting with a precision honed through years of experience. She sidestepped his charge with effortless grace, her hands darting out to grab his wrist and redirect his momentum. Using his own force against him, she twisted his arm and sent him sprawling to the ground, the knife clattering from his grasp and skidding across the pavement. Derek let out a choked cry of pain, but he wasn't finished. He scrambled to his knees, his movements frantic, and reached for the knife again. Layla's foot shot out, kicking the blade far out of reach before stepping back to create distance. Stay down, Derek, she said sharply, her voice ringing with authority. This is over. But Derek refused to accept defeat. With a guttural roar, he lunged at her again, his hands outstretched as if to grab her. Layla reacted swiftly, sidestepping his clumsy attack and sweeping his legs out from under him. He hit the ground hard, the air rushing from his lungs in a loud grunt. Before he could recover, she moved in, locking his arm behind his back and pinning him to the ground with practiced ease. The senior officer rushed forward, his gun drawn but pointed downward. "That's enough," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly from the adrenaline surging through him. "Sanders, you're done." Layla held Derek down for a moment longer, her breathing steady despite the intensity of the situation. Then, with deliberate care, she released him and stepped back, raising her hands in a gesture of non-aggression. "He's all yours," she said simply, her tone devoid of emotion. The senior officer holstered his weapon and knelt beside Derek, quickly slapping a pair of handcuffs onto his wrists. "You've lost it, Sanders," he muttered, his voice filled with a mix of frustration and disbelief. "I don't know what the hell you were thinking, but you're done." Derek didn't respond. He was too busy glaring at Layla, his chest heaving as he struggled against the cuffs. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice venomous. "You'll pay for this." Layla met his gaze with an icy calm. "You've already lost, Derek. The only question now is how much worse you're going to make it for yourself." The senior officer hauled Derek to his feet, his grip firm as he guided him back toward the patrol car. The second officer, who had been watching the entire scene unfold with wide eyes, stepped forward, his expression a mixture of awe and apprehension. Is this for real?" he muttered under his breath. "She just took him down like it was nothing." Layla ignored the comment, turning her attention back to the senior officer as he returned from securing Derek in the car. "This needs to be in your report," she said firmly. "Every detail. His aggression, his recklessness, the way he escalated this situation. If it isn't, I'll make sure it's handled through other channels." The senior officer nodded, his expression grim. "You have my word, MS Houston. This will be addressed." Layla gave a curt nod, her body finally beginning to relax as the adrenaline coursing through her veins began to subside. She glanced toward the patrol car where Derek sat, his face a mask of fury and humiliation, and then back to the officers. "Good. Then my business here is done." Without another word, she turned and walked away, her footsteps steady and deliberate as she disappeared into the shadows of the parking lot. The officers watched her go, the weight of what had just transpired settling heavily over them. For them, this night would be a long one, filled with paperwork, explanations, and the fallout of Derek's actions. For Layla, it was just another mission completed, another situation survived. But even as she left the scene behind, she couldn't shake the lingering thought how many more Dereks were out there, and how many wouldn't stop until it was too late. The parking lot was eerily quiet now, the earlier chaos fading into a subdued tension that hung heavy in the cool night air. The red and blue lights from the patrol cars continued to flash, casting fleeting shadows against the buildings, but the urgency of the scene had dissipated. Layla's steady footsteps echoed faintly as she walked away from the confrontation, her silhouette disappearing into the darkness at the far end of the lot. Though her face remained calm and unreadable, her mind was still racing, dissecting every moment of the encounter. She had neutralized the threat, maintained her composure, and avoided unnecessary harm, but there was no denying the weight of what had transpired. Behind her, the two officers were still standing by the patrol car where Derek now sat, his head lowered and his shoulders slumped in silent defeat. The senior officer, visibly exhausted, rubbed the bridge of his nose and muttered something to his partner, who nodded stiffly before heading back to their vehicle. Layla didn't glance back as she reached her car and opened the door, slipping inside with practiced ease. Her movements were deliberate, her breathing steady, but the moment she closed the door and sat down, she allowed herself a brief moment to exhale deeply. The adrenaline that had carried her through the encounter was ebbing now, leaving behind a familiar but unwelcome mixture of frustration and unease. Layla rested her hands on the steering wheel, her fingers tightening slightly as she replayed the confrontation in her mind. Derek's unhinged behavior had been predictable. In many ways she'd dealt with men like him before, men who clung to their authority like a shield to mask their insecurities. But what troubled her most was the escalation, the sheer recklessness of his actions. He had been willing to risk everything: his career, his reputation, even his own safety, all because he couldn't accept being challenged. And the system that had allowed someone like him to operate unchecked, that was the real danger. She reached into her bag and retrieved her phone, her fingers moving quickly as she typed a secure message to her superior. The agency would need a full debrief, and she wanted to ensure that every detail was documented before the narrative could be twisted by local authorities or anyone else involved. As she hit send, a sharp knock on her car window startled her momentarily. She turned to see the senior officer standing outside, his expression cautious but determined. Layla lowered the window, her gaze meeting his with quiet intensity. "MS. Houston," he began, his tone measured. "I just wanted to say, thank you for handling that as professionally as you did. I know this wasn't an ideal situation, and I can assure you that Sanders' actions will be addressed." Layla studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "I appreciate that, officer," she replied. "But I hope you understand that this goes beyond just addressing his behavior. What happened tonight wasn't an isolated incident, it's a symptom of a larger problem. If someone like him feels empowered to act this way, unchecked, it means the system itself is enabling it." The officer nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "You're not wrong," he admitted, his voice tinged with a mixture of guilt and resignation. "We've had complaints about Sanders before, but things like this don't always get the attention they deserve. I'll make sure this one does." "I hope so," Layla said, her tone firm but not unkind. "Because if it doesn't, you'll be dealing with far worse consequences than just a reprimand. People like him put everyone at risk: civilians, fellow officers, and the integrity of the badge." The officer's face hardened, and he gave a sharp nod. "Understood." Layla nodded back, then rolled up the window without another word. As she started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, she caught a glimpse of Derek in the rearview mirror. He was slumped against the window of the patrol car, his face a mask of bitterness and defeat. For a moment, Layla felt a flicker of something almost like pity, but she quickly dismissed it. Men like Derek didn't deserve sympathy, they deserved accountability. The drive home was uneventful, the streets quiet as the city settled into the stillness of the early morning hours. Layla's thoughts remained focused on the events of the night, but as she pulled into her driveway and turned off the engine, she allowed herself a moment of clarity. She had done everything right: maintained control, neutralized the threat, and ensured that the situation didn't spiral into something worse. But the weight of it all still sat heavily on her shoulders, a reminder of the constant battles she faced both in and out of the field. Inside her home, the familiar surroundings offered a small measure of comfort. She set her bag down by the door, kicked off her shoes, and made her way to the kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound as she poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, staring into the dimly lit room. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she glanced at the screen to see a reply from her superior. "Debrief received. We'll follow up with local authorities. Good work tonight, rest up." Layla set the phone down, her lips pressing into a thin line. Resting wasn't exactly an option, not when the memory of Derek's rage and the systemic issues it represented were still fresh in her mind. She knew this wouldn't be the last time she faced a situation like this. Men like Derek were everywhere, and the systems that allowed them to operate often protected them from real consequences. But if tonight had proven anything, it was that those systems could be challenged. People like her could make a difference, one confrontation at a time. She finished her water and turned off the kitchen light, making her way to the living room. Collapsing onto the couch, she closed her eyes, the events of the night playing in her mind like a film reel. She thought about Derek's anger, the way his pride had driven him to reckless extremes, and the quiet resignation in the senior officer's eyes as he promised to take action. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. As sleep finally began to overtake her, one thought lingered in her mind, a reminder of the fight she would continue to face in her work, her life, and her pursuit of justice. This wasn't the end. It was just another step in a much larger battle, and Layla Houston was ready for it.